Hello, History Leaks here. One of the main characters in the new show Shogun, based on the novel by James Clavell, is a Japanese warlord by the name of Yoshi Toranaga. But interestingly, his exploits are based on a real-life historical figure from feudal Japan, who was known as Tokugawa Ieyasu. Tokugawa Ieyasu went from being a child prisoner to one of the most powerful military rulers in Japan, establishing a shogunate where his descendants would rule unchallenged for the next 265 years. So who was Tokugawa Ieyasu? He was born in the year 1543, a time in Japan known as the Sengoku or Warring States period, where there were many different clans ruled by daimyos or lords vying for power, fighting against each other, so it wasn't a unified country at that time. Tokugawa Ieyasu, one of the most confusing things about his story is that he was born with a different name, and throughout his life he changed his name multiple times. And that's because in Japan at the time, children were given a name. You were given a name when you were born, and then when you reach adulthood you were given a new name. But Tokugawa Ieyasu also changed his name a few other times. When he would switch allegiances to different lords, he would often adopt a new name. And so just for the sake of the video, I'm just going to refer to him throughout as Tokugawa Ieyasu. But he was born as Matsudaira Takachiyo, and he was the son of a minor daimyo of the Matsudaira clan, based in the Mikawa province on the largest of Japan's islands. At this point, the Sengoku period or Warring States period had been raging for decades. It was a time of relentless fighting and civil strife between the daimyos, which kept Japan divided. The ever-shifting loyalties of Ieyasu's father, Matsudaira Hirotada, meant that Ieyasu was actually offered as a hostage to secure an alliance with a neighboring, more powerful clan called the Imagawa. This was common practice. It was very common to send a child hostage to kind of solidify an alliance, to ensure that Ieyasu's father would follow out any orders and he wouldn't betray the Imagawa. And while young Ieyasu was being transported to the Imagawa clan as a hostage, another rival clan they were at war with, called the Oda, got wind of this and intercepted the caravan and kidnapped young Ieyasu for themselves and demanded that his father, terminate the alliance and submit to the Oda, who were enemies of both Ieyasu's father and the Imagawa clan. The Oda asked him to submit to them or they would execute his son. How did his father respond? He said, "Go ahead and execute him." He didn't want anything to get in the way of his alliance with the Imagawa. He wanted to show the Imagawa he was that loyal that not even the execution of his own son would stop him in, being their ally. He was, he wanted to show that he had the utmost loyalty to them. But at the same time, he showed how cold-hearted and brutal he was. So the Oda ended up not executing young Ieyasu. They kept him as a hostage, although he was still a nobleman. So even though he was a hostage, he was a prisoner, he was still treated quite well, he was educated and lived quite a good life. During his upbringing, he would have received military training and education in matters of governance, and from a young age, he did prove himself to be an intelligent and diligent pupil. Eventually, young Ieyasu's father died. He was killed at the hands of his own bannermen, which isn't surprising. He wasn't very well liked. And so young Ieyasu was, in the end, sent back to the Imagawa as a hostage, both in a state of confusion. They were both having some succession issues, with the Oda leader dying as well. So he ended up being a hostage in the Imagawa anyways. And while he was there, he got married as a young man. He had 2 children by the age of 18, and he was basically raised as one of their warriors. But at the end of the day, he resented them because he was a prisoner and he wanted to take back leadership of his own clan. And eventually, that opportunity would come when the Imagawa were defeated in battle by the new leader of the Oda, who was called Oda Nobunaga, one of the future great leaders of Japan, and he crushed the Imagawa in a battle where young Ieyasu wasn't present. He was somewhere else. And Ieyasu, he was very smart. He was very clever. He could see where the winds were going, and he decided to pledge his allegiance to the Oda and switch sides. Even though Tokugawa Ieyasu was known to switch sides many times to different clans throughout his life, he could also be very loyal if he wanted to. And he did demonstrate great loyalty to Oda Nobunaga. And over the next 2 decades, he would rise to prominence and expand his own clan's territory by serving Oda Nobunaga, who would become the most powerful man in Japan. In fact, Tokugawa Ieyasu was so loyal to Oda Nobunaga that at one point his son married Oda Nobunaga's daughter, which was a common way to solidify an alliance. And Oda Nobunaga later on accused this son, Tokugawa Ieyasu's son, of plotting against him. And how did Tokugawa Ieyasu respond? He immediately executed his own son and his wife for simply, the accusation of plotting against his ally, Oda Nobunaga, And it shows that not only was he cunning, he could also be cruel. He could also be ruthless and bloodthirsty, and nothing would stand in his way to, survive, basically. Not even his own son. All in all, he would have 2 wives in his life, a host of concubines, and he would father 11 sons and 5 daughters throughout his life. In 1582, Oda Nobunaga died after being betrayed by one of his own vassals, and he is said to have taken his own life in seppuku. This created a power vacuum where one of Nobunaga's best generals, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, stepped in. Tokugawa Ieyasu, although he was initially cautious and unsure about Toyotomi Hideyoshi, he eventually sided with him, and as part of their ongoing attempt to unify Japan, they joined forces to defeat one of the other most powerful clans called the Hojo. And as a reward, Hideyoshi gifted Ieyasu the Hojo provinces to the east, in the condition that he gave up his own existing territory. Despite the risks of starting anew in an unknown land, Ieyasu eventually agreed. And he moved his entire administration to a small fishing village called Edo, where he immediately began a massive construction project to transform the area into a political center to rival Kyoto and a cultural hub for artisans and businessmen. Because of Tokugawa Ieyasu, the small fishing village of Edo would eventually grow into the largest city in the world, which is today known as Tokyo. Even the castle that Tokugawa Ieyasu is to erect at Edo would become the largest in Japan and the foundations for the modern-day imperial palace. As Tokugawa Ieyasu was ruling his new district, kind of away from all of the other troubles of Japan, his influence and power kept growing. Another characteristic of Tokugawa Ieyasu is that he was very patient. Often, one of his greatest strengths was simply just waiting. Toyotomi Hideyoshi was very ambitious, and he actually took his armies and invaded Korea. He even had plans to not only invade Korea, but China and even India. And so he took a lot of soldiers with him to Korea, and it was kind of a disaster. But Tokugawa Ieyasu was clever enough to not get involved with that at all. And he consolidated his forces. He didn't waste any resources or manpower on that invasion of Korea, only made him grow in power while the other daimyos were weakened. Eventually, Hideyoshi would die in 1598, and by that time Tokugawa Ieyasu was the most powerful daimyo in Japan. And he was appointed to a council of 5 elders, tasked with ruling Japan on behalf of Toyotomi Hideyoshi's heir, who was still a young boy at the time. But this was Tokugawa Ieyasu's opportunity to take power for himself. And this was the moment he had patiently been waiting for. ever since he was a young man. So Japan was split to those who were loyal to Hideyoshi's heir and those who were loyal to Tokugawa Ieyasu. And it was the Western forces versus the Eastern forces. And eventually, the Eastern army, led by Tokugawa Ieyasu, defeated the Western army, which was led by a man called Ishida Mitsunari, at the decisive Battle of Sekigahara in 1600. He was outnumbered at the Battle of Sekigahara, but he somehow managed to convince some of the daimyos on the other side to betray Ishida Mitsunari. And in the middle of the battle, a large contingent of his forces actually turned against him. So that's another example of Tokugawa Ieyasu being a cunning tactician. And to keep control of the daimyos, Ieyasu, he shook up the political landscape by moving them to different parts of the country and confiscating the lands from his enemies and giving it to his new allies. Tokugawa Ieyasu was really not liked. He wasn't generally liked by people, but people did respect him, they did fear him. He wasn't as nice of a guy as he's portrayed in the show. And pretty much to be a great leader, it's not necessarily about being liked by people. Eventually, he split the daimyos into three classes: the Shinpan, those related to the Tokugawa clan, the Fudai, his loyalists, and the Tozama, those who swore fealty after Sekigahara. And each of these classes had varying degrees of restrictions within his new system, the Bakuhan. He consolidated his power at Edo, and he would control everything from there. And this is why the next period of history where Tokugawa Ieyasu ruled would be known as the Edo period. Eventually, Tokugawa Ieyasu was awarded the title of Shogun by the Emperor of Japan in 1603, officially marking him as the preeminent warlord in the land. But only a few years later, he would actually retire his role and put his son in charge. His son was called Hidetada. But in reality, Tokugawa Ieyasu really was in control. This established his shogunate as a hereditary rule, and that's really what he wanted, preventing future clans such as Toyotomi Hideyoshi's heir, Hideyori, from claiming anything, claiming their right. Another interesting thing about Tokugawa Ieyasu's rule is that initially, he was very open to foreigners, to European trade, but once he was established as a shogun, completely switched his opinion, and he kind of closed off Japan from the outside world. He didn't allow any more European traders to operate in Japan, and it's not because he didn't like them, but that was really because he was paranoid about any outside forces working with someone else to kind of overthrow him. And I think he had seen this happen, throughout his life. He was very experienced in these matters of, switching allegiances and betraying people. And I guess he himself was paranoid of that happening to him. Oftentimes, these outside forces, the Portuguese or whoever it may be, they may, support or fund someone else to overthrow him, for their own benefit. And that's really the true reason why he kind of closed off Japan from the outside world. Funnily enough, except for the Dutch, they were the only foreign group, I believe, who were allowed to keep trading, but it was only authorized in the port of Nagasaki. And they actually would build a man-made island just off of Nagasaki, connected by a bridge where the Dutch traders would live. They wanted to cross the bridge into Japan. There were guards, they would have to show some papers, and it was, a big thing. But they were actually allowed to stay there and operate, the only foreigners who would do so, because they proved that they were not interested in any politics or religion for that matter. They were only interested in trading. And they also gave Japan news from the outside world, which they still needed. Finally, in 1616, Tokugawa Ieyasu would die. He died of an illness at the age of 73. And a magnificent mausoleum and shrine were erected in his honor in a place called Nikko in Edo. And a few things about Tokugawa Ieyasu. Some people say the reason why he was able to live so long was because he lived a healthy lifestyle. He was known to have a love of swimming and bathing. He was known to even swim in the moat of Edo Castle. And another one of his loves in life, he was an avid lover of falconry. Falconry was one of his favorite pastimes, and that also would have kept him fit. And he actually has a very interesting quote all about falconry. He regarded falconry as excellent training for a warrior. He said, "When you go into the country hawking, you learn to understand the military spirit, also the hard life of the lower classes. You exercise your muscles and train your limbs. You have any amount of walking and running and become quite indifferent to heat and cold, and so you are little likely to suffer from any illness." And another thing, it's said that Tokugawa Ieyasu fought in 90 battles throughout his life, so he was a battle-hardened warrior. And he was also interested in various kunjutsu arts. He was a patron of the Yagyu Shinkage Ryu school and also had them as his own personal sword instructors. And this school is still something that you can find being taught today in Japan. The Tokugawa clan lives on today. 19 generations after Tokugawa Ieyasu founded the dynasty, his descendants are still alive today. There is Tsunenari Tokugawa, who is 84 years old. He was the head of the Tokugawa clan today. He worked for a shipping company for many years, and once he retired from there, he set up his own non-profit foundation called the Tokugawa Foundation, which aims to preserve the last remaining cultural treasures of the Tokugawa family. And many of these treasures and artifacts were lost during the Meiji Restoration and World War II during the US bombings. So even today, the Tokugawa clan lives on. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like, comment, and subscribe for more historical content like this in the future. Thank you guys for watching, and see you next time.